Good morning. This is Jason Dean coming live at you again for another Film Fanatic show. Hope everyone's doing good. It is 9:44, and yeah, we just had a pretty major snowstorm. Just kind of pretty much dug my way out. Had to get up super early this morning. Feeling pretty awake for the most part. Had to get up at like 6. My girlfriend had to go into work. She was scheduled to go in like in the late morning, but then some people called out. They were sick, so now she had to go in early. So I got up about 6 and we dug out of the snow. There was a lot of ice and it wasn't too bad. It was a little bit of an adventure. So, and then yesterday we had probably about 7 inches of snow, but then it rained and then it froze. So that was a little bit of a challenge. But luckily, I went out yesterday and did quite a bit of shoveling, so then this morning wasn't that bad. So yeah, and feeling pretty good. I felt like I've been away for a few days. I stayed down at her place in Rockland for about 3 days, so I've been away from doing any videos. So I'm feeling inclined, feeling the itch, feeling the burn to do some more Film Fanatic videos. I want to thank the uh, the cool and crazy fans of this page that continually support this weird thing that I do. Love you guys and love that people are always commenting on the videos and try to always respond to every comment. And it to me it's about that exchange of ideas about movies that we all love, movies that we're discovering, movies that I'm trying to bring to the table that I feel are not always talked about. And then I also like try to bring a lot of variety to this channel. I do a lot of music shows as well because for me it's all, it's all interconnected. And speaking of music, this Friday coming up, it's Monday now. This Friday at 7 o'clock, we have a quantum show coming up at Hey Sailor, where Hey Sailor is an awesome venue. We've played there. We've been really fortunate this year and especially last year, the last couple of years, especially last year, we've gotten to play there a lot. I really love that spot. It's got a beautiful sound system, beautiful stage. Pound for pound, I think it's the best music venue around. It's just a really, I don't know, just a really cool environment. It feels like a professional environment. Great food. So we'll be playing there this Friday at 7 o'clock with the Button Men. Great electronic music out of Portland, Maine, with Wally, who does like a solo electronica thing. Very much in kind of a synth wave, dark wave, 80s kind of inspired vibes or vibe or aesthetic. Super cool. We got to play with the Button Men last year a couple of times. We played once at Hey Sailor, and that was a blast. It was like in the late, I think it was in the late winter or springtime of 2024 last year. And then we played a festival with them over the summer. And we also kind of played with them at the All Roads Festival. We were not directly on the same bill, but we played at the same venue. And great, super awesome dude, and really awesome music. So really excited. We're going to be playing first. We're going to start at 7, play for probably 45 minutes or so, and then the Buttonman will finish out the night. So very excited. So if you're around, Hey Sailor, it's a I don't know, $5 or whatever to get in. So great food, great atmosphere, and yeah, good way to kick off the or get rid of the winter blues if that's a thing, which I understand. So, being that I'm talking about music, I tried to, like I said in the beginning of the show, I try to bring some variety to the show. Music, the arts, really in general, for me, and film especially, are all kind of interconnected. And today I want to talk about, and I think I've done about 2 or 3 videos on this band, and they are my favorite band, my favorite group of all time, and that is the British duo Autechre. They've been around since almost the late 80s. Just amazing. They are my favorite band. I mean, and to say or call them a band is not really. I know some people would say that's not maybe accurate, but I look at them as a band. It's a duo. They're a duo from England, and they have been, for me, my biggest like source of inspiration when it comes to music. They're my favorite band. I can listen to them any day, any night, anytime. It doesn't matter. And I want to talk about my introduction to Autechre. And I've been a fan of their music for, geez, probably close to 15 plus years, I would say. And I'm going to talk about how I discovered them, how I got turned on to them, and the first album that I got exposed to that made me an obsessive fan. When it comes to my band Quantum, I'm, obviously very inspired by lots of different things. Film especially, and film mostly, around, that entails everything from, where we try to have a real theatrical kind of presentation. That's totally taken from my love of horror films, slasher films in particular, as well as soundtracks and film scores from all of those classic movies, especially from the horror and exploitation world. Film is the biggest influence for me. I had a past of where I threw my hat in the ring of trying to become a filmmaker. It was a lot of fun, and I have some experience. I did a film when this short little film that's kind of a piece of shit called Rapture. That was a short little vampire movie, but that was, even though it's not something I can get behind or that I'm proud of, it's not something I would show really to people. I did show it at one point. We did many years ago. We did have an opening for it, and we had like a premiere, and we showed it at this really cool art gallery that is now defunct in Belfast at Aarhus. So I did have a show for it, and I've had friends see it here and there, but it's not something I'm really proud of. But it was my first time doing it. But the thing that was so awesome, and it was so much work. It was one of the hardest projects that I ever invested time and energy into. It was a big financial expense. Creatively, it was so incredibly challenging. But overall, for me personally, and I guess artistically, it was one of the best experiences I ever had because I learned a lot about film, and it gave me a whole new respect for filmmakers and the art form, and it just increased my love for film. And then before that experience, I did have experience working on music videos. I shot videos for a couple of years before I decided to try to take the chance and make a movie. I shot videos for a band that I was in where I had shot a bunch of footage, and then we used it for like this kind of multimedia presentation where we would project those that footage and those images on the band, kind of like a Velvet Underground kind of vibe. And I did that for a few years. So I do have experience working in the film world, for what it is. But so that world is the biggest influence on my band Quantum. And since I started the band Quantum, that fulfills that desire, that need to function more or less in that world. And the obvious music, all the musical influences. And Autechre, when it comes to electronic music, they are definitely my biggest source of inspiration. I'm always blown away. I'm always stunned by how beautiful and well, apocalyptic their music can be, and how versatile they are, how the high level of musicality. And to me, it just speaks volumes on our. For me, it's like our soundtrack to this, well, dystopian age that we live in. To me, it's the perfect soundtrack to that. To me, it's like equivalent to Autechre. For me, is equivalent to, what the '60s were with Bob Dylan being kind of the soundtrack to that kind of social upheaval that was going on. People crying out for equality and justice. Bob Dylan, I think, for that generation was the soundtrack for those changes and those turbulent times. And I look at Autechre as being this, or my generation's Bob Dylan in a lot of ways, because I feel like it reflects all of our trials and tribulations being in this digital age and in this kind of dystopian environment that we have created ourselves. So that to me is like kind of the meaning behind it all for me when it comes to Autechre. So I wanted to do a show today about the first album that I got into and that changed my life really and made me a rabid hardcore fan. So the members of Autechre, Sean Booth and Rob Brown, they are the founding members of Autechre. Again, they've been around since the late '80s, late '80s. I mean, it's insane how long they've been around. The other thing that I admire so much and I love about Autechre is that, for me, being such a massive fan of their music, they always keep me guessing. I always feel as a listener and as a fan, they always keep me guessing. They always keep me on my toes. I never know. Like, they definitely have a style, and I can tell. I'm at a point now I can hear like a couple of seconds of their music, and I know it's them. Like, they have their own sound, they have their own personality. But at the same time, each album of theirs and each thing that they kind of venture into, I think is radically different. And they always have this like futurist approach. Like, everything feels, it's like everything is set at least 10 or 15 years before anyone else is doing it. Obviously their music has, like I said, for me it's a perfect for this dystopian age that we live in. It's a perfect soundtrack. But obviously their music has, the other thing that I love about their music is the mixture of, they have some darkness, but then they also have some beautiful soothing qualities to their music. And it's really, I love that juxtaposition. I'm a huge fan of that in music, where, because to me that's very much real life, and to me their music always has kind of expressed that, those, like that duality to a degree. And I feel like, I mean, there's obviously some bands, I kind of think of it as like the AC/DC syndrome, which isn't bad, and I love classic AC/DC like anyone. And I listen to a lot of metal, also a lot of metal bands and death metal bands, a lot of black metal bands. And sometimes I feel like, as much as I love that music and it's such a part of my DNA, a lot of the times there are bands out there that more or less put out the same album for 30 years. And I kind of attribute that, or that's when I think of the idea of um, and I call it the AC/DC syndrome, which sounds kind of funny. And when I use that term, I'm saying it in a way of like, it doesn't take a high end intellectual to like analyze AC/DC's music. it's great, great rock and roll. But for the at face value, they have essentially put out the same album for 50 years. Same thing with like the Rolling Stones, for instance. They have a very uh, set formula that obviously works, and they stick in those confines for their entire career. And, that obviously has worked massively in their favor because they have their fans and people come to expect the same thing all the time. They want the same kind of structure. They don't really want surprises. They're not going to, ACDC, if they're not going to do an electronic album, they're not going to do a pop album, they're not going to do an avant-garde jazz album. That's not going to work in that context. But there is this thing of like where they have been putting out the same album, and I see that a lot of the times, like I said, in metal. And as much as there are lots of rock and metal bands that do take those chances, and I gravitate towards bands that do take those chances. But for instance, like Cannibal Corpse do the same thing. One of my favorite bands, but they have essentially more or less put out the same album for 50 years. Not maybe not 50 years, but it's that same thing. And there is a weird thing sometimes that I struggle with where that gives that it has this kind of conservative thing around it where people want the same thing. They want a level of familiarity. They want to be comfortable, so they want to hear the same stuff all the time. And I love that band, and it works. But it's all in the context. But I love artists and gravitate towards artists that keep you guessing. And you don't really see, they take these left turns a lot throughout their career. And each record is literally a surprise. It's a whole fresh new palette of colors and ways that they find to express themselves. I think of bands that do that. One of my gods, David Bowie, for instance. He's a master of that. Chameleon. Every record, every persona that he inhabited was vastly different. And I really gravitate to artists that do that because for me it's like it's more variety as a listener and as a fan. And then when there's a new album put out by that particular artist, I'm even more excited because I'm like, oh wow, what are they going to do now? It just comes down to that. Another band that I think really does that and is all about that is a band called The Liars, which is one of my favorite rock bands of all time as well. They're probably, when it comes to like, indie rock, or like noise rock or experimental rock, they're definitely my favorite in that genre. And they do the same thing. They literally reinvent themselves each album. And you never know. They have their style, they have this particular sound, but you just don't know what's going to come next. And I love that. And to me, Autechre is the epitome of that. And that's why I love them so much because literally everything that I've listened to, every album that I have of theirs or everything that I've ever listened to throughout their career, I always feel like I'm on a sonic adventure, some kind of odyssey, and I don't know where it's going to go. And I just love that. And to me, that's like the sexiest quality of their music and why I cherish them so much and why I really look up to them. How I discovered them it's probably like 15 years ago, which is crazy, was around the time when I went to school in Boston. My good friend who has actually been on this show, and I've talked about him a lot, my really good friend Sean Russell, who was really, really responsible he was one of those key figures that made me into the film fanatic that I am. One day, he used to live down in Portsmouth, and I used to visit him on break. I met him in college at Berkeley College of Music. He's an amazing composer and a super talented guy. He does soundtrack work for TV shows and documentaries. He was playing drums at the time, and we became really close, and we would hang out all the time. But he was, well, I guess for all intents and purposes, he was a more advanced, uh, technically proficient musician than I was at that time. He had, I went there and I had no real exposure to jazz or fusion. I pretty much went there as a total like metal rock guy. And so he was a key person to who exposed me to Miles Davis and Mahavishnu Orchestra and all of this amazing music, all kinds of world music. And so we would spend time talking about music, hanging out, and talking about music and movies. And movies was a major thing of what we talked about and shared. I was a big film fan then, but it just really expanded from that meeting and becoming friends with him. But, and he had a real deep love of electronic music. I did too. I had a big love of house music. And he really turned me on to a lot of great bands. And that band that is today's focus is Autechre. And he played me. We would go. He lived in Portsmouth, and there was a. He was also the first person to introduce me to Bull Moose music, which I do all of my major shopping at. And he had told me about this band that he thought I would really love called Autechre, which was this British duo of electronic music. And I was like, well, okay, this sounds, the way he described it sounded like it's totally something I would be into. He kind of described it as this kind of ambient, experimental, you know, dance music. It had beats and grooves, but it was a little bit more on the fringe side of things, a little bit more experimental. And the first album that he gave me, I remember he played it for me at his house, and then I went out and bought it at Bull Moose, was a double album called Tre Repetae. And it's a double album. Actually, there's like a regular studio album that came. It's a regular studio album, but there was also a bonus disc. So I kind of think of it as kind of a double album. And it was a studio album that they put out many years ago. It came out in 1995, so I believe it was their third album that they put out, which is crazy. And again, like before I had heard this album and Autechre, and this album in particular, Tre Repeti, I had, only heard like house music. I had friends in high school that were DJs. I grew up, even though I was a rock kid and metal kid, I I like to think that I was pretty open minded to music. I was into. I grew up in New York and I had friends that were DJs, and they were techno DJs. They played a lot of kind of the early form or stages of techno music, kind of high energy music, and then also house music. And that was the time of, a lot of 90s hip hop. So I loved all of that music as well. And I also, the first electronic group I ever got into, Depeche Mode, which I've done a big show on, and I will do more shows on them because they are legendary. They were my first electronic band I ever heard. But for the most part, up until I heard Autechre, I kind of had this notion or thing in my head that electronic music was, pure dance music, and especially I really started from techno. I really got into house music, and so I equated electronic music to be kind of like, that bump in four on the floor music that people would, do lots of drugs and get really high and, get their booties shaken. And it was party music, and it was all real upbeat dance music, four on the floor. And it had a certain kind of commercial thing about it. And I always felt like, oh, that's to me when I thought of the genre of electronic music, I only thought that's what it was. It was just kind of four on the floor house music, which house music to me today is still, one of my favorite musics when it comes to electronic music and just in general. I still listen to that style of music. I still, very much am a big fan. Groups like Deep Dish, Anthony Papa, Sander Kleinberg. There is a series of records that came out in the late or early 90s called the Global Underground, which was like all house music more or less. And it was all really good, like kind of dark. And the music was pretty dark. It had a high energy. It was all dance music. And the this label, this new music that was coming out, the Global Underground had put out that was the Global Underground was a label in England, and they were putting out all of these DJ mixes, Sander Kleinberg, Anthony Papa, and I love that stuff. But I always thought, and I still love that music. I still listen to it. Anthony Papa is like one of my favorite artists. But I always thought that's what electronic music is. And then when I heard Autechre for the first time, and in particular this album, Tre Repetae, I was like, whoa! It like literally blew my brain out of my head. Like I was like, what? Because it literally took my notion and of what I felt was like quote unquote electronic music and just smashed it to smithereens and just totally destroyed it because this album Trevor T and my exposure to Autechre, to me it was like it was so unique and so different and so foreign and it was so otherworldly and so futurist sounding that I like I didn't it almost like it was obviously electronic music, but it seemed like even using that label at the time was too limiting because this music was so far removed from the music that I grew up on, being the techno scene and the house music scene. This was so unconventional, so much more kind of ambient inspired, so much more, I don't know, to a degree emotional, like where it had so many different emotions. Some of the music on this record is so just absolutely lush, gorgeous, and beautiful. And then some of the music is really intense, really dark. It had this real. The other thing that I was blown away by it was that it for me, it felt like I was listening to a soundtrack to a film. And it was very mysterious, ambiguous, and it was just transformative. Like I had never heard anything like this. And it definitely has this album definitely has a dance quality to it, if you will, but it's not party music per se. I mean, it's music you can listen to in a quiet space, but then it's also music that sounds incredible on a massively loud sound system. So it it just was a total game changer, and it just destroyed my notion of like, oh wait, electronic music can be so much more and is so much more. It had elements. I felt even today, it had elements of hip hop, elements of like avant-garde music, even elements of jazz, elements of ambient music. There was so many different qualities to it, and it was suddenly I felt like, wow, what these guys were doing, it's like it's kind of limitless to how one can express themselves, and yet maybe at the end of the day still refer to that style as electronic music. And it was a game changer. And when I first heard this album, Trapati, I was obsessed with it. I listened to it nonstop, 24/7. and it remained and still remains an album or albums that I still go back to. You know, it's probably, the box set that they put out a few years ago, which I did do a show on, is like probably my favorite collection of Autechre records. It's a big box set that they put out a couple of years ago that has like 7 albums on it, and it's the best thing they ever did. But as far as sheer straight up studio albums, I think Repetae is probably their best. But it's again, it just blew my mind away to such a degree, and changed my whole perception in every way possible. And being a fan of music, like that's, or even cinema. I mean, that's happened to me with cinema too, or for reading a book. It's a really, when you think of that happening to that degree, for myself and probably for anyone, it happens to people where it's like a truly transformative experience, but it's kind of rare. It's not something that happens. It's not a regular occurrence. You'll be impressed by things and you'll be like really excited or blown away by something, or you won't like something. But as far as like where something really is like a game changer, like that's a pretty unique thing that happens in a certain or particular time and place. So, it's a very magical experience, I think, when that happens. I think it really is. I think it really speaks volumes about the talent of Autechre, and I look at them as being artists. Again, they do have a dance quality to their music. So, but at the same time, I feel like they have that perfect balance of being artists and feeling like they can express themselves in so many ways, but have a more or less some kind of groove or pulse to their music. Some of their music is literally just really stripped down and very ambient, but it still has that certain quality. And when it comes to some of their music that is very much ambient and very minimalist, I mean, obviously the master of ambient music, Brian Eno, but but Autechre, and I think it's definitely the case with Brian Eno, is that, you can take a composer or a writer and they want to say put out a piece of music that is really minimalist, but there's times where maybe they just don't have that focus, and that music could become, could be, for all intents and purposes, it might be just be rendered boring. Or when it comes to electronic music, sometimes it can take on a new agey quality, and it's not really something you're going to be engaged in. It might be just purely background music, like if you're, going in for a massage. Um, but Autechre has such a skilled hand where they're able to strike that balance, and it's all about the that lining up that those melodies and those chords and putting them in the right place. Even if there's, like, you take a track of theirs that might have 2 or 3 chords tops, and you take somebody who is not quite as skilled as them, and it could be just rendered kind of boring and just meandering, and it doesn't really go anywhere. But with them, is they have that focus of where they can speak volumes with very little. And to me, that's the most inspiring quality of their music. And I've talked about this experience before, but about 10 years ago, my girlfriend at the time surprised me with tickets to go see them. And it was the most, when it comes to music concerts, it was the best show I've ever seen in my life. And it was one of the most incredible experiences. And, you know, when it comes to like I said, they're definitely not a four on the floor, dance party band. But when I saw them, it was unbelievable because it was like they were playing some of the most interesting and bizarre abstract music I've ever experienced, and intense music. It was so intense and so primal and guttural and beautiful. And again, it's all about that juxtaposition, light and dark. But people were just like dancing their asses off, and people were so into it. All of the people that were there, it was at Three Art Space in Portsmouth. That was a really amazing, amazing venue with the best sound system I've ever heard. And it was the capacity of like 200 people, and it was just like, or 200 or 300 people, and it was packed. It was sold out, but it was just like it was unbelievable, and it was a full-on dance party. And the lights, there was no lights. They turned off all the lights in the venue. All you could see was the light from the immediate stage of where they were, and oh my god! And then I had the whole experience, which I've talked about before, of meeting them, and just being so blown away by going over there. I remember, when my girlfriend at the time bought the tickets, I was just like, holy shit, like I couldn't believe it. And then she knew what a massive fan I was, and she liked their music quite a bit too. She got into them also. And she was like kidding around with me, like, what about if you get to meet them and you get to, hang out with them or something? I was just like, no, like, I was kind of starstruck at that prospect. But I remember us seeing them, and I was just like, literally, my brain and soul was melted because it was just such just a mind blowing experience. They were there walking off the stage, and I remember looking over, and Rob from Autechre was happened to be looking over at me, and he looked right at me, and I remember giving him like a thumbs up or something, and then he looked at me, and I could see that he saw me, and then he called me over, and I was like, whoa. And my girlfriend was like back by the bar, and I was a little ways from her, and I walked over there, and he's like, hey, how are you doing? And I was like, oh, great, amazing. And he's like, so what are you up to? And I'm like, well, I was kind of speechless because I was just in this total like trance state. And he's like, do you want to hang out with us? And I was like, yes. And so my girlfriend saw me talking to him, and she came over, and then he was like, hey, do you want to, both of you guys, do you want to come and hang out with us backstage? For no real reason. He just like saw me there, and he saw that I gave him a thumbs up of like, and I think I had said something like, thank you. That was, I think I said a quick thank you, like just how incredible the performance was or whatever. So I didn't really talk with him, and he just invited us over. So then we went backstage. We went through the barricade, the blocked off area, and they had this little dressing room in the back, and then they had this other area behind, which was where their big bus was, and then they had a like this outdoor area where they were hanging out. It was Autechre, their crew, and the opening band, and there was one other guy, one other fan that was back there. And I felt like, wow, like it's gonna be a quick meet and greet, like we'll shake hands and and whatever, and just like talk, and then we'd be ushered out of there. But instead of that happening, we ended up like hanging out with them for like 2 or 3 hours, maybe more. Like it was crazy, and they were super. They were like the coolest guys, and it was one of the most amazing experiences. And they were super sweet, super nice, and they were just very like there was nothing about them that was like pretentious. They were just a couple of dudes, and they were just like they were telling us all these great stories about the tour, and like I remember one of the things that they said that was always funny, that always stuck in my head, that still sticks in my head, about how they you know they again, they've been around for so long, and they've toured everywhere. They've been in every part of the world touring, but they don't come to the States all that often. They tour all the time in Asia, all throughout Europe, and they have been to the States a lot, but most of the time It's not a super common thing for them to come to the United States. So seeing them was a rare treat. Um, but they were talking about how they really hate playing New York and how they have to deal with like they always have these problems with they always get these like really shitty sound guys and they always like get to the gig, they do these sound checks and they never can dial it in right and they have these like they said they always get stressed out, they never get the right sound guys and it's never a good time. And they said anytime a touring cycle comes up, they're obligated to go to play in New York because of their touring, and what they need to do. And they're also part of Warp Records, which is, a massive label. So they're like obligated to play in New York, which is the biggest city in the world, but they hate playing there. And it was just really funny hearing them complain about it and all of these things. And they had said that that gig at Three Art Space, which we were at, they thought that that was one of the best sounding venues. And I remember them saying, "Oh, I hope we didn't come out like playing. I hope our music wasn't too aggressive." He felt like they came out of you know, the they came out like all guns blazing, and I felt they might have like pushed it too hard. And I was like, no, and it was just they were just very very cool and very humble about it, and not like pretentious and I remember them talking about like their recording process. Like I remember, you know, like we once I was super nervous, but once we started to kind of chill and I felt a little more relaxed and seeing how they were just like totally disarming, we started talking about music and then you know about how they record and like the process of how it takes them forever to record music because they're always like constantly coming up with these different ideas and they're always like throwing things at the wall and nothing really sticks for a long time and their whole process was really interesting and one of the reasons they do play a lot of gigs and one of the reasons they don't like playing a lot of gigs is they prefer to be in the studio all the time working on things. But it was just amazing and it was the greatest concert I've ever been to and the you know one of the greatest experiences of ever meeting them. I think of them too as being like I made the Bob Dylan analogy, but I feel like Autechre for me is like what Miles Davis is to jazz or Charlie Parker is to jazz. I feel like Autechre is that to electronic music. So I want to do a show where I talked about my introduction to my favorite band of all time. So thanks again, and we will see you next time. Peace.